The way in which an author tells their story is crucial because it determines how readers will not only interpret the text, but also shape the reader's opinion of the author themselves. A narrator is the reader's guide through their literary journey, a journey that may be reflective of some of the author's own personal perceptions. Some authors, such as Walt Whitman, use the first person to tell their own personal stories, whereas authors like Herman Melville will use their imagination to create their own fictional world, like in Moby Dick. Looking at Whitman's Leaves of Grass and Melville's Moby Dick, we can gather how they are similar in the way they carry themselves, as symbols of democracy, knowledge, and open-mindedness. There is this misconception about works of fiction not being altogether true. However, looking at Melville's character Ishmael, who narrates the tale of Moby Dick, we find traces of Melville reflected in him. For those who don't know, Melville was a seaman in 1845, and his adventures inspired him to write works such as Moby Dick. Not only is Ishmael a reflection of Melville, but he also shares many of the same characteristics as Whitman's own persona. Both Whitman and Melville's Ishmael are very democratic in the ways that they perceive the world. Their belief in equality and their receptivity to peoples of different ethnicities and cultures is depicted in their works. Whitman sees himself as the voice of America, all of America, not just for the white men in America, but for the women and black slaves as well. He values the democratic idea of equality, and since he lived at a time when slavery persisted, it is safe to say that Whitman was anti-slavery. We can gather that this is his stance by the way he describes slaves in I Sing the Body Electric. In this poem, he says, "Whatever bids of the bidders, they cannot be high enough for the slaves." Likewise, Melville was also anti-slavery, and although Ishmael only casually mentions slaves a few times, his relationship with Queepeg is an indication of his ability to get along with someone who is of a different ethnicity, culture, and whose beliefs are completely far from his own. To him, who ain't a slave, we are all humans just trying to make do with what we have. The two narrators also share the habit of expressing as much of their knowledge as they possibly can on any given subject just to show the readers that they know what they are talking about. Sometimes this information seems rather useless, but at the same time, it can be quite fascinating to see how much they know. Since Whitman often refers to himself as the poet of America, he sees to it that he encompasses all he sees around him. Whitman knows that in order to capture the essence of America, he has to relay all the knowledge he has of those who live in the country and the events that take place within it. That is why in the preface, which was published in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he lists all that he knows about America, from the different types of birds to the various perceptions of liberty. Whitman attempts to spill out all his knowledge to show his readers just how American he is. Through Ishmael, Melville shares his own knowledge of ships and sailing. Like Whitman, Ishmael rambles on and on about all the newfound knowledge he gains along his journey. Not only does he share what he learns about sailing, but he even shares with the readers insignificant moments, such as when he learns his chowder has a fishy taste to it because Horsia's brindled cow was feeding on fish remnants. As insignificant as this may seem, it makes him more relatable because most of us probably do the same thing when we talk about our journeys. That is, we mention everything we find amusing, whether it be relevant to the important aspects of our trip or not. It is evident that Whitman and Melville were influenced by the transcendentalism of the mid-19th century. Unlike the American writers before them, these writers challenge the status quo and are proud to present themselves in their narrations as hard-working middle-class men in search of expanding their knowledge. Something about wanting to expand your knowledge is having to explore realms that some deem as immoral. For example, Whitman freely explored sexuality in his poems, and at a time when sex was something nobody dared to speak of. In fact, the mere sight of a woman's ankle was considered scandalous. Therefore, although some of his poetry received praise, those poems exploring sexuality caused people to condemn him for such profanity. Melville too tests the waters, playing with the ideas of sexuality. However, he does so in a way more subtle than Whitman. Ishmael's relationship with Cleapeg oftentimes hints at some kind of sexual tension between the two characters. Some may deny that that was Melville's intentions, but looking at how Ishmael describes his interactions with Cleapeg, it is difficult to say that there is nothing fishy about the ways in which they show affection for one another. Especially when Ishmael at one point says, "In our hearts, honeymoon, lay I and Cleapeg, a cozy, loving pair." Whether it was intentional, which it really seems to be, or not, clearly there is something special about the chemistry between the two. Essentially, everything that Whitman and Melville do in their texts is purposeful. They have an idea of how they want the reader to think about the narrator, and be able to have some kind of connection to them. Their contradictions are there so they may come across as average people, flawed and always learning. They want it to be known that they have knowledge, but at the same time they demonstrate how it is critical for us to open our minds in order to understand the world more clearly. Because as smart as we may think we are, we may not be seeing the big picture. The way they present themselves in their narratives is perhaps meant to encourage the readers to put aside their prejudices and stigmas and experience life to the absolute fullest.